My name is Dr Pete Gladwell. I'm a physiotherapist at the pain service at French Hospital in Bristol. Just completed a PhD at the University of the West of England.
Okay.
Shane Palmer at the back was my professor and supervisor of the work. It's really nice to get a chance to talk about the work, some of the puzzles that came up. And my plan this evening is to talk about three main areas. One is about the research itself, but also to talk a little bit about pain, what we know about pain and what we don't know about pain. And also, finally, the importance of asking the right question in research. They're the three areas that I'm hoping to talk about. And I'll kind of weave through the different elements of the story this evening. I'm going to start with a wee bit of history. This is a picture drawn by René Descartes, who was one of the first people to take a scientific approach to pain. Now, very interesting approach. René Descartes was the first person who wrote quite so clearly about the role of the nervous system in processing pain. But he thought it was very much a direct route from the periphery, whatever was in pain, the foot in this case in the picture that he drew that got too close to the fire, right the way up through the nervous system up to the brain. Much as those old-fashioned bell pulls that you have. You pull the handle and the bell rings at the far end. But we knew that something else more complicated was happening. We knew that there were times that people experienced pain when there didn't seem to be anything going on to provoke it. And we also knew that there were people who you'd think ought to be in pain who weren't. So there's something else going on. Descartes was brilliant, but he created a problem for us, unfortunately, within healthcare, particularly with pain as well. Now, Descartes artificially separated the mind and the body when he was talking about healthcare, and he would argue that the body was like a machine, and therefore scientists ought to be able to find out how the machine worked, find out which of the cogs might be broken, possibly figure out how to put it back in a better way. So that focus on the body as a machine with moving parts was made at a time really not long after the Church had put Galileo under house arrest for suggesting that the Earth went round the Sun. Descartes had to be quite careful about what he was saying 400 years ago. So he separated out mind and body at the time to allow science to focus on the body and how the body worked. He probably would have said more had he felt able to, but because he had to be cautious, he's allowed this development of two sets of ideas, the mind and the body. And we now have specialists within healthcare in the mind and specialists within the body. So, we have this lovely picture. Some people might recognise that. Is anyone a Doctor Who fan? There, the cogs of the character there. And the mind, the soul, the thought bubble that, you know, when you die it floats off to heaven. So this wasn't an idea that was challenging the Catholic Church at the time. But it has created a sense that people have pain that is real, physical, and that people have pain that is imaginary, that's psychological. And that's one of the problems that unfortunately has come from this idea of dualism from Descartes. And it's this idea that pain is a measure of what's happening in the body. If you have a lot of damage in your knee, you get a lot of pain. I overheard a snippet of a conversation once, just walking down a country lane, three chaps in front. One of them was clearly struggling to walk, and he was saying, yeah, they've arranged an MRI to see what the damage is. And it's this idea that pain equals damage comes from this idea from Descartes. It's a clear message. Pain lets us know what's happening in the body. But, as I was saying earlier, we know that there are problems with that. We know that there are people who have horrendous injuries and don't report pain at the time. And that's been known for as long as there have been battlefields. And we also know there's situations where people experience pain. One of the classic stories was a workman, rough, tough guy, got a nail through his foot and it was sticking out the top of his work boot. And he was in agony, but he wouldn't let anybody touch it. He was taken to hospital, and it's only when they arranged an X-ray and realised that the nail was sticking between his toes and not through his foot that he allowed anybody to do anything about it. Now he was in pain. That was real pain, stimulated by the image of the nail going through his boot. And apparently they've kept the boot and the nail in a hospital museum in Oxford. So we know there's more going on. not just a simple measure of what's happening in the tissues. Otherwise it would be really simple just to use pain scales like this in pain research, and then we'd understand everything that was happening. And these pain scales are used. This is a standard one, from no pain to pain as bad as possible. You apply the scale, find out whether the treatment's reducing pain or not. If it was just this simple, this would be all we need to do. But there's a lot more going on with pain and pain research. This is one of the turning points, really. Melzack and Wall in 1965 developed a theory they called the pain gate. Now this is a famous gate. Does anyone recognise that? Yeah, it's the gates to Buckingham Palace. Main aim of the gate is to keep people out, us, generally the rabble, the riffraff. And these gates are defended against anything coming through. They defended these gates with what looks from the gate like a submachine gun. So you don't want to be messing with this gate these days. It's quite a serious gate, it's highly defended. The idea of the pain gate was that actually the nervous system can operate like this. It can defend itself from information coming in, and some of those defences are a top-down mechanism to protect information from overriding the nervous system at times, possibly in an emergency situation when the brain needs to be able to function and it doesn't need to be completely swamped by information coming in. So this was the idea of the pain gate in 1965. This is a major breakthrough in pain research. We know that the gate mechanism, it's been modified, it's been adapted, we know it's more complicated, but I still think the nervous system gates itself. It's a useful idea. It's interesting going to Buckingham Palace. There's another thing stopping you going through, and that's tourists. It's really difficult to even get that photo because of the number of tourists. And actually our systems are like that as well. One of the things that we know stops pain messages getting through is other information coming in. We all know that. You bang your elbow, you rub it. That rubbing sensation, it's like the tourists outside Buckingham Palace. The rubbing information blocks the pain messages coming through. So that pain gate was a useful metaphor. Within a year, we had TENS machines being promoted. Now, TENS is one of the stories this evening. This is a TENS machine, small, portable, runs off a 9-volt battery, so it's fairly safe. There's a clip on the back, self-adhesive pads. You put it where the pain is. If you've got knee pain, it goes on the knee. If you've got neck pain, it goes on the neck. It's a very flexible approach. The patient can control it. They can turn it up, turn it down. They can speed it up, slow it down. Lots of control over the sensation that people get. And they get what can be a really lovely tingling sensation, although I have to say some people don't like it. They find it unpleasant. But usually by fiddling around with the settings, you can find something that works. Come have a play in the break if you want to. Wire up to a speaker and see what you make of that. It's a piece of kit that ought to work. In theory, this really, really ought to work. From basic lab studies, from animal studies, this really ought to offer pain relief. But the research so far has not been conclusive. So the Cochrane review, where they look at all good quality research, analyse all of the research available on a particular health area, suggesting actually at the moment we don't know whether TENS works or not. So it's been around for nearly 40 years, there's been research published, and we're still not sure whether it works or not. One of the problems has been around the quality of the research. So at the moment we don't have enough high quality research. But it's frustrating because this is either something that could be relatively safe and useful for patients, and we should be able to say, yeah, try a TENS machine, or maybe it doesn't work at all, in which case we shouldn't be spending money and resources on it, and we should be putting those resources elsewhere. So it would be really helpful to get a clear answer to this. Is it something we can recommend or not? It is recommended for osteoarthritis of the knee and the hip as an adjunct to treatment. So the research for osteoarthritis of the knee and the hip is slightly better, but most of the research in chronic pain is leaving us a little bit unsure about whether it's helpful. A bit more about pain, back to the pain story. This is a picture of the areas of the brain that light up when somebody's in pain. Functional MRI scans like this that show us areas of brain activity, oxygen uptake are really, really helpful to understand how our brains work. They've radically changed pain research. There's a huge amount of this work out there now. What they still don't do is tell us how pain feels. And it's really important not to get caught up looking at a scan like this and think that it's showing the pain. Just to give you an idea of that, look away if you've got sensitive natures. That's an image that might give you an idea of pain. This is from the Chief Medical Officer's report on chronic pain in 2008. And it just reminds us that pain at the end of the day is an experience. It's something we feel. So you can't see it on a scan. It's more complicated than that. It's something that we have to experience for it to be going on. There's some amazing artwork about pain. This is probably one of the least upsetting ones. There are plenty of others. The Chief Medical Officer's report is worth a read if you want to see some scary statistics. Pain is common. Persistent pain, chronic pain if you like, which is my clinical specialty, is really common. Lots of people develop pain problems and they don't settle from all sorts of common causes. So I don't want to worry you too much. There's a lot of pain about, is the message. So if we can find a simple, cheap, relatively safe treatment, we should be using it. If we're not sure it's working, there's a question mark around that. That's a problem because we could be recommending a treatment. So we've talked a bit more away from just Descartes' idea of the tissues and pain being a simple measure of the state of the tissues. The smaller peripheral nerves can get more sensitive, and certainly that's key for certain pain problems. The pain after shingles, for example, we know there are changes in the way that messages are passed through the peripheral nerves that can generate pain, really difficult pain to manage. Pain goes through, we've talked about the pain gate. There's also areas where we know that the nervous system can just get wound up. I like that, a nice medical word that means the same thing in plain English. Pain wind up. So processing becomes a problem within the system as a whole. But it's only when the messages reach the brain and we perceive them that it's pain. So if I feel something in my knee, that's only there because my brain is perceiving that sensation in my knee. It's a really important distinction to make that. Pain at the end of the day has to be an experience, brain generated, but not simply reduced patterns of brain activity. So there we've got 4 levels. Top level, where the pain is, well, everything else goes on. What we think, what we feel, any worries we've got. What's the boss going to think if they see me limping today? What's my partner think? I was going to do the lawn today, I'm not going to manage the lawn. All of that goes on in your brain at the same time as the pain. So we can't treat pain simply as a medical problem because it's part of life for so many people and it involves what people think, what they feel and their day-to-day concerns. So already we've got more levels to think about in terms of pain research, but it gets more complicated than that as well. I've added the whole body, how somebody moves, their activity levels, their posture, how they hold themselves, how they communicate. If I stub my toe, I'll probably communicate that. You will know if I stub my toe. That pain that I experience has then become a social event. So you might respond to that. If you're really empathic, you might feel the pain of my stubbed toe. If you're really kind, you might laugh at me. It's all possible. But pain becomes a social event, and people's responses to our pain shape how we then behave, what we do. Social environment matters a lot, the media matter. There have been some big media campaigns advising people about the management of back pain. It's happened both in Scotland and in Australia as well, whereby having a big media campaign informing people about positive, active management of back pain, it's improved outcomes. So what we read in the newspapers matter, what our GP tells us. It all starts to shape our behaviour shapes our outcomes with pain. So it becomes a much more complicated story. And then you look at the interactions between it, the arrows going up and down and through and across. You're looking then at a massive system with all sorts of potential interactions. So our simple question of does a TENS machine work, you can then think, well, what part of the system might you be looking at to figure out does a TENS machine work? It starts with a simple question of can't you use a pain scale, and you end up with a lot of complexity. So, a bit about pain. My first interest in TENS research came from an audit, which was asking people that use TENS machines in the pain clinic to manage long-term pain, what the benefits were for them. There was a chance to ask a question that hasn't been asked a lot, which is what do people do with a TENS machine? And people are saying, well, yeah, it helps with pain relief. That's the obvious answer. But also it can help with reducing medication. It can also help with specific activities. And I was really interested in this. Very specific activities. Going to the theatre, social events, coming to the science cafe, for example. Travelling, that was a big one. Doing housework, prolonged standing, cooking, shopping, walking, gardening. Very, very definite, precise activities that people were involved in. So I started to think, if we're going to get involved in research asking people about using TENS, how do we know what of this to capture with different outcome measures? Sitting was one of the key themes, and that really got my interest because I started looking at some of the standard outcome measures. Now this is a bit of a nerdy bit. There's a range of outcome measures that are used, like the Rowland and Morris Disability Questionnaire, Pain Disability Index, the Brief Pain Inventory. There's a range of them. The sort of standard thing you might have to fill in if you go into hospital, 20 questions about what you can manage. And these questionnaires will have all sorts of items about, do you have difficulty getting dressed? Do you have difficulty walking? None of those outcome measures had any items related to sitting. So if TENS machines are really helpful to allow people to sit for longer, none of these outcome measures would have picked that up. So I started to see a problem, and that fed into the PhD question eventually. And the primary aim of this was to explore the range of benefits that patients report from their use of TENS, to help us to focus research so that we're actually asking the right questions and capturing the right benefits from patients. Making sure that the research is sensitive to the benefits that patients report. I used a form of research which is qualitative research. Now, a simple definition of qualitative research is its basic data form is words, it's language, compared to quantitative where the data form is numbers. What it usually amounts to is asking people about their experiences, about their lives, what they do, why they do it, when they do it. And it was really interesting spending time with people. We interviewed 9 individuals who collectively had over 80 years of experience of using TENS. So that was a huge amount of experience to tap into, huge amount of data to analyse. And I used a data analysis method called thematic analysis, where you're looking for patterns, things that you pick out after a while, and then look to say, do other people have this theme as well? Very interesting work, takes a long time. It's quite hard. But the results have been very interesting. Some of it's simple. This is a pain scale again. But I asked this guy, obviously wasn't that's a pseudonym, just show me on the scale what that change is like. And he was able to suggest a 15mm reduction on this 100mm scale. Very small reduction in pain, but for him that was enough of a difference to get into work some days. And this is a chap that got paid if he went to work and didn't get paid if he didn't. So he was highly motivated to turn up at work and get paid. But on the bad days, when his pain was more intrusive, the TENS machine offering only that much pain relief was enough to make a difference for him some days. So that was worth knowing. Looking through the data of those 9 individuals, there were some very obvious, what I call direct benefits of using a TENS. Pain relief, which is what you'd expect. But also, more interestingly, help with muscle tension and spasm. And that hadn't really been looked at in the research before. So that was a question we hadn't been routinely asking patients about their experience of muscle tension, muscle spasm linked with pain. That's a really common problem, particularly with people with spinal pain, neck and back pain. But people talked about being distracted from the pain. The tingling sensation that they got was taking their minds off the pain. And that hasn't really been explored in research before. So it's very helpful to start asking these questions. But the thing is then, it leads to more difficult questions. So I was trying to figure out, is this a direct benefit, or is this just how people are describing how it works? But the things that people were saying, I think, helped me figure out, actually this was a direct benefit. It might also be how the tense works to some extent. But this is one of the participants. It distracts, it disguises, it changes the pain for a while. You get some time off the pain if you get it right. So they were clearly describing it as a benefit as well. Another person talked about turning it up so it kind of covers up the pain. And then somebody else talked about it's quite good for the distraction thing apart from anything else. Just having the impulses kind of takes your mind off the pain, but it helps with pain as well. So we have 3 direct benefits now, not just pain relief, distraction from the pain as well, and help with muscle tension and spasm. So it gets more complicated. 3 questions to ask. But also, how do you ask? Really difficult. And this is one person talking about the pain scale. Called Moira for the study, and she would actually say it didn't change how she would make a mark on the pain scale. So her experience suggests we can't rely on pain scales to talk about distraction. We've got to find some other way in to ask people, if this takes their mind off the pain, how do we get into that? How do we get some good information? It's very difficult to know exactly what question to ask. Just to give you an example, if I get you to be aware for a moment of your elbows, just notice any sensations, your clothing maybe. Some of you might be resting your elbow on the table. How aware of your elbows are you at the moment? You got that? How aware were you a moment ago before I asked you? It's difficult to know, isn't it? Just asking the question changes. Sorry about your elbow, Bob. I'm more aware of it now. I'll change the subject, I'll distract you. The indirect benefits were interesting as well. Some people were talking about reduction in medication. But interestingly, the only people that talked about that were the people who had problems with side effects. So one person, for example, called her Fran. I work full-time, as you're aware. If I have to take medication at work, the side effects affect my ability to work. With the TENS, there's no side effects. So for her, reducing medication is really important. Other people were saying, well, I use it on top of medication. So how people use TENS starts to change the outcomes that they get. So it's not a simple question of applying the treatment. It's actually how do people use the treatment. And this is one of the big themes coming out. And some people would use it when they're rested. So we have a theme of enhanced rest. This is really interesting. Some people will rest in a planned way. Fran again was here talking about this. It's very much part of a package. Some people might just be able to deal with the pain with the TENS machine, she was saying. But unfortunately, I'm not one of those people. So I do other things. I use aromatherapy oils, I relax, especially after work. So she would get home and have a planned rest, use aromatherapy, and she would put a TENS machine on during this, and she would get a better rest, and then she was ready for action again. So that planned rest with TENS would be more effective than if she didn't use TENS. There are psychological benefits, but also the way that people looked at their activities was really interesting. This is a bit of a matrix. So if somebody was talking about one of the benefits, was sleep. Sleep hasn't been researched in the past in terms of TENS. So we know now, on the basis of these people talking about better sleep, falling asleep sooner, we really should be asking that. The question marks is where it wasn't clear in the interviews whether it was a benefit or not. Plenty of people talking about sitting, standing, walking. So these basic activities, people were saying, actually it helps me with these activities. But not everyone was helped in all their activities. So that's the other thing, people are different. Some things will help more than others. In terms of daily tasks and activities, shopping, looked at housework, social life, travelling. These are the kind of daily activities that people were reporting benefits. But what I found interesting is the things not on the list. Nothing dynamic, no large range movement, not very much involved bending, and no rapid movements. And there's a bit of a story behind that as well, which is the problems of wearing a TENS machine. If you imagine it's got sticky pads, if you bend, the pads peel. You might catch the lead. It's a tricky device to wear sometimes, particularly if you've got a hairy back or hairy legs where you want to put the pads, or depending on your clothing. So sometimes people will say, actually, I just use it when I rest, because otherwise it's a real hassle. So, Claire, for example, if I'm doing something more active, I probably won't put it on in case it comes off or something happens. Whereas if I'm just doing something fairly relaxed, I'll put it on, because it won't matter if something comes unstuck. So again, it's a how do people use TENS, not what does TENS do to people. It's about strategy. Sally, as we called her, would only use it during a pain flare-up, and her experience of flare-ups was so awful that any kind of benefit would help her during a flare-up. So she says, yeah, they're awful. Those days I've said I'd rather not be there on my bad days because they're awful, they're horrible. So using a TENS machine for her on a bad day would take the edge off, it would help to reduce some of that suffering. So that leaves us with 4 main strategies. During a flare-up, when you wouldn't expect it to help with function very much. During a planned rest, as Fran was doing. During specific activities that people choose where the problems aren't too great. And for some people, during general day-to-day activity. So depending how people will use the TENS, we have different outcomes. Do you see how the research doesn't get any easier the more you talk to people? I almost wish that you hadn't asked the question to start with. But I think this is really important. If we're going to be finding out how these devices work for people with pain, we need to figure out what the benefits are. So the summary so far is that the benefits are modest in size, working on several levels, which is why I introduced the idea of levels or domains earlier. This isn't just about the pain experience, it might be about function, it might be about sleep, medication, muscle tension, distraction. Distraction is a possible benefit that's going to be difficult to find out more about. It takes time to learn. It takes time to learn to overcome the problems, how to fiddle about with the settings. Maybe 3 months. So that's an important thing that we learn from talking with patients who use these. It depends on a whole range of factors together. Somebody's skill of using the device, how long they've practiced, how their pain behaves. So we're really going to have to think hard about how to move forwards from here in terms of research. It has not made the situation easier. One thing that we did, just to finish off, is a little bit nerdy, but I like it. There's such a thing as the World Health Organization of International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health. And this is basically a book of nearly everything that people do. It's what they call a taxonomy. It's a list. So I've just listed all the things that you're doing at the moment. D4103, you're sitting. D115, you're listening, I hope. There is a code for sleeping, I hope nobody's doing it. I didn't put that up. D560, drinking. And D9100, the Science Cafe, is an informal association. So nearly everything that you can do ought to be in the book. And this is quite helpful because I was able to go through the interviews and code what people were saying as the benefits and start to get a sense of how it all shaped up. Now this is too small to see, it's not necessary that you see it, but it's got all the codes down the side, shopping, housework, all the things that we've talked about, and how many ticks are in the boxes is how many individuals reported benefits. You're seeing quite a scatter of ticks there. That's the main part here, it's just the scatter. What's a benefit for some people isn't a benefit for others. A lot of people reporting walking, sitting, but not everyone. If you then try and compare these codes with outcome measures that are commonly used, well, these are some of the measures that have been used in the past in TENS trials, the low back outcome score, the Oswestry Disability Index, the Rowland and Morris, the short form 36, all these different outcome measures with the various questions. Again, you can see the scatter of ticks. There's a mismatch. The commonly used outcome measures in the past haven't captured many of the benefits that patients are reporting. So it's really helpful to ask patients that use these devices, how do you use it, when do you use it? Because otherwise we might be asking the wrong questions and getting the wrong answers, and then feeding back unhelpful information to patients. Perhaps saying that a treatment doesn't help that does, or suggesting that it does help when it doesn't. So it's been really helpful to talk to these patients and to do the analysis to find out the kind of questions we should be asking and shaping this up. So just to finish off, how do we measure distraction? If you've got the answers, let me know, that would be lovely. It's a tricky one. What might be the most functional outcome measures? So this is where the mapping exercise is so helpful, because if we get an outcome measure that doesn't match what patients report, we'll be able to say, actually, we probably shouldn't be using this measure. We should be using one that matches more closely what patients report. How do we account for the strategic use? This is what real-life people do. They don't make research easy. They'll use a treatment in this way, but not that. And we need to figure out how to account for that. That's not going to be easy, but it's really important. And how do we individualise outcomes? Maybe that's what we need to do, is actually not do the standard type of trial, but maybe we need to break this down on a case-by-case basis, which makes statistical analysis a lot harder work. But maybe that's the only way forwards. And finally, just to check that we're asking questions that make sense to patients, using wording that makes sense. Because otherwise we could be running into problems asking questions that we think make sense to researchers, but that don't actually make sense in plain English. So wherever we go, we've got to check by working with patient partners that we're asking the right questions. So we'll finish off with acknowledgements, partly to our PhD supervision team, to the patients that took part, to my colleagues. I went a bit absent-minded in the middle of my PhD. They supported me, and to family and friends as well, but primarily to the patients. We wouldn't know any of what we've learned without their input. Thank you.